Hello, I'm Bill McDonald of Charlotte County Libraries and History, and welcome to Ode to Local Writers. And our guest today is Sylvie Alexander, who has written Ghost Stories of Pontegorda. Eve, can you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe even how you got started in writing?
Well, the reason I wrote this book is because I own a walking tour business. And when I started the business, I was telling people about the history of Pontegorda, which I researched very thoroughly. And a lot of people liked the history, but some people wanted more. And the feedback I got was they wanted ghost stories like they hear in St. Augustine and Key West. And then on another tour, I was talking about this feedback, and a man told me, well, when we spent a week in New Orleans, we went on a different tour every night. We went to all the same places, and we heard a different story every time. And I thought, oh, okay, I guess I can make up my own stories. So since I was making my own stories, I thought, might as well publish them in a book. Yes. And that's how that happened.
And what did you find unique about Ghost Stories of Pontegorda? Anything that was tied into Pontegorda's history, or that it goes back a while to the 1880 or so, that lended itself to good ghost stories? Or what about Pontegorda that made it a good place for ghost stories, do you think?
Well, we do have a lot of written history here, thanks to Vernon Peoples and U.S. Cleveland and Lindsay Williams, who wrote extensively. And so we already had a lot of material. And then, of course, Pontegorda is just so charming and Victorian. But as you mentioned, it only dates to the 1880s, so it's not as old as St. Augustine or Key West. Right. And so we didn't have a lot of ghost stories, and we only have one bona fide haunted house, which is the Sandlin home. So I had to reach a little bit.
And what was the process like writing these ghost stories? I suppose you had to do a lot of research and...
I love doing historical research, and like I said, we had a great foundation with the earlier writers. And I took their information and I tried to come up with innovative ways of telling the story. For instance, everybody knows the story about Mary Leah Sandlin, who burned to death in an ironing accident. And so I wanted to tell that story, but I wanted to tell it in a different way. And so I did find that there was a little boy named Frankie Smoke who lived in that house. His family was the next family to move in after the Sandlins. And so I told the story through his point of view as a scared child living in a haunted house through letters he wrote to his grandmother in Savannah.
Wow. So that was a different way of telling the story.
Yeah.
And would you like to read an excerpt from either the Ghost Stories of Pontegorda or something that maybe influenced that? Or?
Actually, I have an idea.
Sure.
The story I wrote about Mary Leah Sandlin, the 14-year-old who died in that house, as I was writing that story, something sparked that helped me write this story that I'm going to read for you today. So I will read to you this little excerpt from the story called Scary Mary. Dear Grandma, nothing irregular about Pontegorda should surprise you by this time. On Sunday, there was a disastrous accident and 2 young people lost their lives on the Peace River. Miss Thelma Johnson was a darling young lady who helped the teacher at school on a few occasions, and all of us boys had a goofy crush on her. Miss Thelma and her recent fiancé, Mr. Lloyd Edwards, had gone on a boating excursion with another couple. It's said a squall came upon them and overturned the boat. The other couple were rescued and claimed they didn't know what became of Miss Thelma and Mr. Edwards. Dad worked all night that night, organizing rescue parties. They'd never seen so many boats on the river and harbor. Ma and I could see them on account of the full moon. In the morning, Dad and Mr. Sinclair came home exhausted. Dad borrowed binoculars from a boat captain and told me to take it up to the crow's nest and look for Miss Thelma and Mr. Edwards. For several hours, I remained up on the roof, keeping an eye on the harbor. I didn't see anything, and truth be told, nor did I want to. In the afternoon, Dad got word that Miss Thelma was found in the harbor east of the Hotel Pontegorda, very close to where she lived with her parents. Dad said the man who spotted her hollered, "Miss Thelma is trying to come home." Now, you'll notice in the story I mentioned the full moon. Because I was researching the event of the death of Thelma Johnson and Lloyd Edwards, and I was curious about this squall. So I researched what the weather conditions were that day, and I didn't find anything about the squall, but I learned there was a full moon, and so I added that into the story. Now, Thelma Johnson and Lloyd Edwards died tragically. They drowned in the Peace River. And Lynn Harrell, who you may know, and
historian.
Yeah, Lynn Harrell and I have both researched this story, and we've talked to family members, and we believe that they were probably murdered, and it has gone unresolved. So I definitely wanted to tell their story, and I didn't know how. But then when I looked up the weather conditions, I learned that there was something else. There was a rare occurrence that day, and it's called a penumbral lunar eclipse. And going from that, I wrote the story called Imperfect Alignment. And that's the one I'd like to read for you.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay. I can't bear to see water hyacinths. There was a time when I thought they were pretty. I loved how they floated freely on the water, bearing spikes of purple blooms, like a blanket on the bay. But now I'm terrified of water hyacinth and take all precautions to avoid being in its presence. On March 23, 2016, my husband and I got up before sunrise and launched our boat to watch the penumbral lunar eclipse. A total penumbral lunar eclipse is rare. It only happens at the most 9 times a century, and some centuries not at all, he told me. Truth is, my husband wanted an early start for fishing and lured me along with the promise of seeing a spectacular lunar eclipse. He made it sound like a big deal, but in fact, a penumbral lunar eclipse is very subtle and looks like a run-of-the-mill full moon. I guess that's why Steve sweetened the deal with a promise we'd dock at Fisherman's Village for lunch at one of my favorite spots, the Village Fish Market restaurant. We set out from Riverside Park Boat Ramp. It's a little north of the Solana section of Pontegorda on Shell Creek. My husband likes it because it's closer to I-75 and rarely crowded. Even Steven, our yellow and white 21-foot Seaway seafarer, purred down Shell Creek, about 15 miles per hour, heading towards the Peace River, our navigation lights illuminating the water around us in green and red. As we followed the twists and turns of Shell Creek, the bright moon appeared ahead of us, to the west and behind us, peeking through trees and around occasional waterfront homes. It was a magical, quiet time of the morning and the darkest hour before dawn, and I was feeling happy that he'd been able to convince me to come along. Once arrived in the Peace River, Steve dropped the anchor, baited hooks, and put a couple of fishing poles in the water. I turned on the cabin light and set myself up under the bimini shade with a couple of celebrity gossip magazines and a thermos of hot coffee. Sunrise occurred around 7:45 a.m. I turned off the light, stood up, and stretched. Steve was busy putting a fish in the cooler of ice. I took some pictures of the beautiful sunrise over the Peace River. As I was looking around, I saw green mats of water hyacinths dotted with purple flowers, kissed by the rising sun. It was like we drifted into a Monet painting. And then I saw something else, something unexpected and horrible. I screamed. "What's wrong?" Steve dropped the fish and slammed the cooler lid shut. "Look over there," I pointed towards the floating water hyacinth just south of us. "Do you see him?" I whispered. "No, what is it?" "Can we get a little closer?" I asked. "Closer to what?" that patch of water hyacinths. Sure, honey. He drew up the anchor and turned on the motor and chugged a few yards southwest. Now do you see him? I asked again, holding my hands over my face. The man under the water hyacinths. He looks dead. Oh, dear Lord, Steve gasped. Yes, I see him. We both saw the bloated body of a young man, fully dressed, his head bobbing under the carpet of water hyacinth. He looked like some kind of grotesque Medusa man with plants rather than snakes growing from his head. I kept my hands over my mouth, trying as hard as possible to resist the urge to vomit. I remember being surprised that my husband was the first to lean over the side of the boat and puke, considering he had taken Dramamine before we left home. I followed suit and retched over the same side of the boat. What do we do? I asked Steve as I wiped my face and hands with a towel. Notify the Coast Guard, he answered. Steve turned on the VHF radio and tuned it to channel 16. Coast Guard, Charlotte Harbor. Coast Guard, Charlotte Harbor, he spoke into the mic. This is Even Steven, over. A voice answered. Even Steven, you've reached Coast Guard. Is this an emergency? Over. We've spotted a body in the water, Steve explained. He's definitely dead, so it's not necessarily an emergency. Over. What's your position? Over. 26 degrees, 94 minutes, 80 seconds north, 82 degrees, 4 minutes, 3 seconds west. Over. Can you stay where you are until we arrive? Over. Yes, we're in a 21-foot yellow and white Seaway recreational fishing boat. It's me and my wife. Over. It took about 12 minutes for the Coast Guard to arrive, but it felt like hours. We tried to avoid looking south where that body was tangled up in the water hyacinths. And finally we saw the Coast Guard heading our way. They pulled up next to us and asked where the body was. Steve pointed to the water hyacinths. There, under the plants, he told them. The Coast Guardsman looked in that direction. Then he picked up binoculars and looked again. I don't see it. Can you approach and point it out to us? He asked. Steve cranked up the motor and moved closer to the mass of water hyacinths. I turned away. It was hideous enough a sight from a distance. I didn't want to see it up close. Right there, he pointed. The Coast Guard still didn't seem to see the body. Steve grabbed a dip net with a long pole and leaned over the side of the boat. I watched him touch the body. I saw it bounce a bit, but then the net seemed to go right through the dead guy. I pulled out my smartphone and took a picture of it, thinking I could airdrop it over to the Coast Guard. But when I looked at the picture, all I saw was water hyacinths, no dead body. Steve was getting agitated. He's right here where my net is, he yelled to them. An older Coast Guardsman approached the one with the binoculars and spoke to him quietly. Then, permission to board your vessel, he called to Steve. Sure, of course, Steve answered. The Coast Guard pulled up alongside us and Captain Corso nimbly hopped onto our boat. Let's sit down and have a little chat, the captain motioned for us to sit. My husband was really impatient, but he followed the captain's orders. This is off the record, just between us. On July 25th, 1926, a young couple died here in the Peace River. They set out from Solana with another couple in a small boat and were hit by a sudden squall. The boat overturned. The other couple were rescued, but Thelma Johnson and Lloyd Edwards perished. Lloyd's body was found 2 days later at dawn, right here, under a large mat of water hyacinths. Lloyd and Thelma were recently engaged, he continued. Thelma was the town sweetheart, daughter of Captain Johnson. She was a lovely young lady, just 24 years old when she died. Her mother, Bertha, always believed there was foul play. You see, Lloyd had given Thelma a 2-carat diamond engagement ring. Back then it was worth $2,000. That's about $30,000 in today's currency. The couple they went out on a boating picnic with, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe Whittemore, the ones who survived, left town right away, didn't even help look for Thelma and Lloyd. When they found Thelma's body the next day, the ring was not on her finger. Her mother had recommended she pin it to her blouse for safekeeping, but it wasn't there either. Sheriff Lipscomb ruled it an accident and didn't open an investigation. Every once in a blue moon, a boater reports seeing a body. Some people believe it's the ghost of Lloyd Edwards. The last time it happened was during a penumbral lunar eclipse. This morning was also a penumbral lunar eclipse, and the day those kids died in 1926, the same kind of eclipse occurred. It happens when there is an imperfect alignment of the sun, earth, and moon. He motioned towards the moon, still faintly visible over the western horizon. The next penumbral lunar eclipse will occur on Saturday, March 23rd, 2024. Steve and I both looked over at the water hyacinth, Matt, and the body was gone. The captain thanked us for calling and wished us a good day of fishing. He boarded the Coast Guard boat and they headed out to Charlotte Harbor. We hustled back to Riverside Park and drove straight home in silence. To this day, whenever I see water hyacinths, I also see Lloyd's bloated blue body bobbing underneath it. His glassy dead eyes are open and staring right at me. I've never gone on the boat again, and since that day, Steve only takes his boat out in the Gulf where there are no water hyacinths.
Has an eerie, chilling ring to the story. Now, do you think that was that the other couple were involved in the death?
Yeah,
and the squall?
Lynn Harrell and I have been, well, first of all, the family believes there was foul play because of the missing diamond ring. And Lynn Harrell and I have done a lot of research, and Lynn actually found an old article, and those old Pontegorda Heralds are not online. You have to actually look at those on microfilm. And she found a little notice where Miss Miriam Beatles, a guest of Miss Thelma Johnson here during last winter, was married to Monroe Whittemore of Lakeland a few days ago. So Thelma knew this girl and her new husband. And I have found their telephone directory listing in Lakeland in 1926. I have never found anything more about Miriam Beatles Whittemore or Monroe Whittemore after that day.
So the diamond ring ends up being missing, and then the surviving couple leave town. So interesting food for thought.
I had an illustrator create this illustration. It kind of shows a man hitting Lloyd with the oar. Thelma's already in the water, and the other lady, Miriam, is looking at her new ring.
Wow, yeah,
that's our imagination, but
absolutely. Well, I mean,
and
who knows? It may have happened that way.
It might have. That's what we think. And I just wanted you to know that house is still here. Thelma lived in a house that's still in Pontegorda. If you're heading east out of Pontegorda on Olympia, it'll be on your left-hand side. It's now Homestead Senior Services.
Oh, okay.
And it has a big sign that says Homestead, but it's a beautiful two-story craftsman home on Olympia, and that was the Johnson house. So I did try to, even though I wrote stories, I tried to really stick to the true history as much as possible. And most of the characters, events, and locations are authentic in my book.
Wow, that's great. Now you have another book too called Love Stories of Pontegorda. Now, are love stories harder to research than ghost stories, or not?
Well, my ghost stories, they were written for a purpose. They were written for the tour.
Sure.
So I have a story about every one of the buildings in History Park, and about a lot of the famous characters like Miss Ollie Brackett, who you probably know about. And so that was the purpose of this one. But the love stories, there's only 4 stories in that book, and 3 of them are very long. They started out about Pontegorda and then just expanded. For instance, there's the first story is about, it's a famous story. It's about an Indian girl who saved the life of a Spanish, he wasn't a conquistador, he was a Spanish soldier. And it is a true story. They say that the story of Pocahontas and John Smith was actually kind of lifted from this true story.
And that happened in Charlotte Harbor? Or
yeah,
something? Wow.
or around this area, yeah. So I expanded on it and made it a longer story. And then another of the stories has to do with the Dick family. The Dick family were early settlers here in Pontegorda, and they only stayed a few years and left. So I wrote a whole big story about that.
Wow. And the other, you said 4 stories total? And do the other 2 take place in the 20th century, or are they still back 1885 or before?
Well, I kind of did them in order. So the first story is it goes back to the days of the Spanish conquest of Florida. And then the second one is in the late 1890s. And then the third story is about Marion McAdowell and Perry McAdowell, who were the first millionaires in Pontegorda. And then the last one is actually also in this book, and it has a different ending. So in this book it has a ghost ending, and in this book it has a real sweet, real sweet love story ending. I couldn't decide.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the walking tours and how the walking tours that you do kind of led to the ghost stories of Pontegorda. Do the love stories also, do you infuse those into your tour as well, or?
Well, not yet. I haven't. Yeah, I just completed this book.
Oh, it's real new.
For Valentine's Day.
Congratulations!
And I really loved writing it. I love research, and I'm thinking about my next book. Maybe it'll be a full-length novel next time.
Well, we like to thank our guests, Eve Alexander, for Ode to Local Writers. And good luck on your next book, if it's a novel or another work of nonfiction. We look forward to it.
And I love researching here in your library.
Absolutely. Well, we're glad to have authors like yourself turning that research into something we can read.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.